My name is Marianne Eden, and I'm excited to be with you today to talk about the integration of multimedia in the early learning classroom. My observation that I've made in my years of teaching is how we use technology in the classroom. While most educators have the access to digital tools to help them plan, research, and communicate, how are we using and how are we utilizing multimedia to actually support early learning in the classroom? How are we building digital literacy in our students? So as early childhood educators, we are keenly aware of the important role that we have in establishing a strong foundation of learning for our early learners. Our role has actually shifted from being a disseminator of knowledge to a facilitator of learning opportunities. And this provides us with the task to guide our students to engage with materials that help them better understand their world around them. As we are developing students who need to be prepared for entering into the digital age, we are entrusted with responsibility to guide them in the use of using digital tools and exposing them to opportunities through multimedia use. So when we look at our role as early childhood educators, we understand the developmental process that occurs between birth and 6 years. And we build on foundations to support early literacy and early development of within these developmental pillars. As early childhood educators, our learners are building their social and emotional skills, and it's our job to better cultivate an understanding of themselves and others. We want to build their cognitive development while they are working to building their spatial reasoning while they're working with puzzles, or whether that's counting stuffed animals to work on their numeracy skills. We want to nurture communication and speech and language when we encourage children to talk with us and to their peers, to provide their ideas and their experiences with each other. And we want to develop their physical and motor skills while we watch them build with blocks and play on playground structures. All of these things are done to help develop the whole child. And research suggests that this whole child approach not only promotes academic achievement, but also, more importantly, it fosters long-term successful development in children. So while we have the what do we teach with the whole child approach, well, now we need to think about how we teach it. So again, extensive research has been conducted to formulate developmentally appropriate practices to promote growth in all of those domains of childhood development. These best practices are rooted in play, and they are supported by explorations that encourage communication and problem solving with peers and educators. As I mentioned previously, our role is to be a facilitator of learning opportunity, and best practices in early childhood education are developed from the constructivist learning theory that provides children with an opportunity to build their learning while they are using their prior knowledge to construct new learning, and while they're also engaging with others to use their other peers' knowledge and understanding. We also want to use understanding by design framework to guide educators in creating opportunities that meet the needs of students based on learning outcomes. So the National Association for the Education of Young Children presents guidelines for the role of early childhood educators based on these developmentally appropriate practices. And we want to, number one, create a caring environment by fostering a loving learning environment that's welcome to all. We want to teach to enhance development of learning. So we're utilizing those pillars of early childhood education to develop and engage students in appropriate learning activities. We want to establish learning goals, and by utilizing the understanding by design framework, we develop learning opportunities to meet the individual needs of students. And we also want to assess students' development by observing, documenting, and conducting different types of assessments to ensure that learning is actually taking place and the objectives are being met. It's also important that we want to establish a relationship with families where we're partnering and we're working together on ways to support learning and commuting successes with those parents. Now, as we enter the digital age, we find ourselves in need of establishing yet another pillar of development in early learners, the digital literacy component. As we continue to grow our reliance on digital tools and technology to communicate, learn, and grow, our early learners need to have foundational support now to develop those technology skills. So recognizing that there is a need for early childhood education to embrace technology within the classroom, guidance of the use of these digital tools was needed. And the National Association for the Education of Early Learning or Young Children collaborated with Fred Rogers Center for Early Learning and Children's Media in 2012 to create a joint statement on the use of technology in early childhood education. And this framework was created because it wanted to assist teachers in guiding best practices for the technology integration within the early learning environment. So now that we have an emphasis on the need to include multimedia and technology in the classroom, we also have a now potential to close an achievement gap and meet even more learning needs with the integration of multimedia. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think we need to probably take a look back at an old neighbor who was one of the most well-known early childhood educators who adopted technology, specifically multimedia and television, to build a capacity to learn character and curiosity. And this pioneer was Mr. Fred Rogers. As a child development expert, Fred Rogers saw the power and potential of multimedia to build the values of early learning. I have vivid memories of watching Mr. Rogers, and I can remember taking trips to crayon factories to see how they were being made and transported by the trolley to a land of make-believe where puppets taught children about compassion and kindness and how to deal with strong feelings of sadness and anger. And he transformed learning opportunities for children by providing many children with the ability to learn and explore places that they may never or have never experienced before. He closed that divide with multimedia. So with advancements in technology since Mr. Rogers, we see new possibilities and new potentials that multimedia can actually impact early learning. For example, YouTube. YouTube provides children with an opportunity to understand the world around them, just as they do discover in their classroom, except we can take them outside their classroom. Just as Mr. Rogers took us on adventures to factories and to make-believe lands, YouTube actually can transport children to different parts of the world to learn about cultures and animals. They can watch science experiments and even take a trip back in time to learn about historical figures. Digital storybooks provides children with an opportunity to watch their favorite character come to life with animation and sounds, while instructive and constructive apps provide students with an opportunity to focus on building developmental skills based on learning objectives. So what does research show us? Well, while we recognize learners as being knowledge constructors, multimedia provides students with an opportunity to construct their learning through verbal and nonverbal channels. Mayer's multimedia principle explains that individuals learn best when instruction is provided with words, whether they are written or oral, along with graphics. And graphics can be anything from drawings, charts, photographs, animations, maps, or videos. So how do we do this in the classroom? Well, just as best practices in early childhood education are rooted in hands-on play-based opportunities that support active processing of words and images, these same things happen when we use multimedia experiences. As early childhood educators, we know that students need to manipulate materials while they are counting. We use pictures when we accompany our words to prompt students to engage in activity. We have shelves filled with books that have both that are read orally and that also have pictures, kind of taking a deeper understanding of what the book is telling them so they have a capacity to learn that. This learning theory is always taking place in our classrooms, and now studies are actually showing that incorporating the use of multimedia in the classroom, along with these traditional based practices, are also increasing literacy skills and motivation for reading in early learners. So what types of things can we use in our classroom? Well, let's take the iPad, for example. The iPad or a tablet has an incredible potential for learning opportunities for younger learners. The portability of the tool and the applications that can be accessed provides creative and instructive and supportive instruction through the use of constructive and instructive apps. So first, instructive apps are apps that are designed to drill and practice basic skills, thinking, learning vocabulary words, and learning your letters, learning sounds, learning numbers, learning colors. The majority of the apps that are marketed to early learners are instructive apps. But let's take a look at another type of app, more constructive apps. Now, these constructive apps are designed to be open-ended. They allow our early learners to design and create and express themselves, which is what we like to do in the early learning classroom anyway. These apps provide students with an opportunity to create music, video, and illustrations that they are able to construct their own product based on the knowledge that they already have. So let's actually take a look at how research has used these different apps to see what impact they have on early literacy development. So using the constructivist theory of learning to guide their research, constructive apps were integrated into the early childhood classroom to actually examine the effectiveness of supporting the early literacy skills of students. So recognizing the features that mobile devices have, those constructive apps, the visual, the photography and the video and the writing and drawing, the researchers saw an opportunity for innovation, learning, and collaboration through a developing of multimodal texts. The preschool students here were able to actually direct their own activities and create their own product to share with others. During their research, they were able to collect 543 digital artifacts to analyze. And what they found was that the open apps actually supported extensions of learning by providing a tool for students to document their thoughts, record stories, and communicate with their peers and people even outside the classroom. For example, in figure 1 up here, we see that a child built a structure and he wanted to actually document his process of how he built it and why he built it. In the next figure, figure 4, we see a drawing that a student had made and she wanted to share it with her family. Now, normally we would just send it home in a book bag and they could describe what happened when they got home, but why not take the opportunity right then and there while the child is actively engaged in their learning to have the opportunity to share with their family by video recording and talking about her character that she made. In addition, there are instructive app studies. So in this particular study, the researchers wanted to see about the differences between the two apps, which are the instructive and the constructive apps. And so what they did is they actually used participants in the early Head Start classrooms in a public school district where the population was primarily Hispanic and lower socioeconomic students. And they wanted to see which type of app would better support the vocabulary acquisition of these students. So the researchers discovered that although all of the early learners made progress in vocabulary development, those who actually used the instructive apps outperformed higher than the other ones who used the open-ended apps when they conducted their vocabulary assessment at the end. In addition, I put down a snapshot of the teachers' perceptions on how they thought what best supported their early learners. And you can see that the majority chose that the instructive apps, or the one that were scaffolded, were more supportive of their learning, that the instructive apps were engaging. There was more active involvement of their participants. And they even encouraged creativity when they were engaging in the use of the instructive apps. So while these studies show the benefits of using different types of digital apps to support early literacy development, we know that the strongest tool to build literacy development in early learners is reading books. So we find that childhood books are filled with words and images that support a story to engage the early learner. But as technological advancements have been made, we now see students who have a new way to experience and connect with literature. So while studying the multimedia theory, Clark and Mayer actually noted that students, again, learn best with words and pictures. They also stated that this multimedia principle works best with novice learners. As early learners are engaged in the emergent reading process, the multimedia principle is a crucial component of the development of reading skills while we are using multimedia in the classroom. So research has actually been conducted to study the effects of digital features of storybooks on children's reading comprehension skills. During one of the studies, it was noted that written words that were complemented by visuals and sounds were shown to enhance mental imagery and understanding of stories. So the study first administered a comprehension test and a retelling of a story to see if digital stories had a positive impact on their recall and their understanding of a children's book. In addition, the researcher referenced the value of multimedia, utilizing the dual coding theory of verbal and nonverbal sensory processing to enhance connections to have a greater retrieval of attention, and that could possibly lead to reading comprehension and retelling. Overall, the researcher did conclude that the use of digital storybooks actually did increase reading comprehension and retelling. In fact, students were able to retell using more details and more words when they had the multimedia tool. Studies have also focused on not only reading comprehension, but also vocabulary acquisition, especially in achievement gaps with low income students. So understanding that low income students do not have the same opportunities to engage in reading activities, researchers sought to discover if access to digital stories, specifically ones that were narrated, could actually provide the support or close that achievement gap within those learners. So using the modality principle of multimedia learning, researchers specifically looked at how ebooks with audio narration can actually support this. So during their sample, Lee focused on 100 diverse first grade students and wanted to have all of the students be involved in each testing situation. So they were able to have the electronic storybook that had targeted vocabulary words that was supported with narration. They had an electronic book that included vocabulary, but did not have the story narration. And then they also had the control book, which was it was a digital book, but it did not have any vocabulary that was going to be targeted, and it did not have any narration. So although the scores were higher in all the students, Lee found that the poorer readers were the ones in the group to have significant gains in vocabulary while listening to the digital text being narrated to them. The skilled and the average readers, however, did not increase their word gain with either of those testing situations. In addition, after concluding with the survey, they had a student survey. After concluding with the student survey, they found that there was a really high positive response, and they really enjoyed the digital storybook experience. So in addition to the comprehension and vocabulary, research has also conducted to analyze the influence on motivation and for reading enjoyment in preschoolers. So within subject design, where students were exposed to reading a digital storybook with an adult support, independent digital book reading, and also reading a printed book with adult support, it was discovered that exposure to the digital storybooks actually has the same effect on comprehension as adult support during print-based learning opportunities. But they found that the participants' enjoyment was the strongest when they had the adult support with the multimedia storybook experiences. So understanding all of this, that we know that research is indicating that there are actual benefits to using multimedia to support learning, why are educators not using these resources? So why aren't they being utilized? The research has made it clear that there can be numerous methods and tools out there available that can be integrated into the classroom. And based on the findings from the studies, not only that they support early literacy, but they also talked about how it's imperative for the educator to be equipped with the knowledge of designing instruction and learning opportunities to actually integrate technology into the support class. So how do we do it? Well, while researching digital media in the classroom, Wilton et al. Suggested that teachers need to consider who is using the media, what media is being used, how will it be assessed, and how will learning be assessed? So through the utilization of understanding by design framework, conducting assessments of multimedia resources, and appropriate scaffolding during multimedia experiences, an early childhood educator has the potential to actually increase literacy performance and provide a foundation of success for all learners in the classroom. So let's talk about the importance of understanding by design framework. As early childhood educators utilize key principles in designing curriculum and instruction based on the learning outcomes while identifying and extending student knowledge, these same principles hold true when we are exposing our young learners to multimedia to support their learning. Wilson et al. Stated how the understanding by design framework guides educators towards utilizing classroom materials as a resource to support learning objectives. Just as we teachers carefully select books to encourage literacy and pick the proper developmentally appropriate math manipulatives to reinforce math skills and provide materials for creative expression, multimedia resources must also be provided with a learning objective. Wilson et al. Expressed that while multimedia is an important resource, it is a supplement to education. It's not a replacement. The results of the studies also talked about how there was a need for proper application and knowledge of multimedia tools. So now that we know that, how do we go about selecting? We have apps to select from, and there are tons of them. So how do we know? Well, when reviewing the results of the studies on constructive and instructive apps, it is interesting to see how the constructive apps develop literacy skills in some early learning opportunities and some early learning participants, but on the other study that compared the instructive and constructive apps, they found that the participants had higher achievement in vocabulary development by utilizing the instructive apps. So as early childhood educators, how do we know what types of digital apps to use? Are the instructive apps better, or should we utilize the constructive apps? While comparing these studies, it is possible to actually provide educators with evidence of the importance of incorporating multimedia based on the achievement goals of the students. Just as we use our knowledge of our learners and learning objectives that we wish to reach, we must also use those same things to determine the correct multimedia resource to support our learner achievement. So we need to understand the learning objective. What do we want our students to learn? And we need to identify learner knowledge. What do they know? So while comparing the instructive and constructive apps to support the vocabulary development for the socioeconomically disadvantaged Hispanic population, the researchers found that the guidance and support provided by the instructive multimedia resource actually may have assisted learners in building their receptive and expressive vocabulary. So the researchers thought that the students who used the constructive apps needed more support than they were receiving to be able to actually utilize the digital tool for the specified learning outcome of vocabulary acquisition. So understanding that the learner's knowledge and recognizing the vocabulary acquisition was the goal, the lower cognitive, highly supportive, instructive digital app was the more beneficial app in this case. In a separate study, researchers found that the benefit of the constructive apps was building reading, writing, and oral skills, but these results supported the importance of understanding your learner because they performed the interventions in 3 different locations. 2 of those locations were in metropolitan school, while 1 was in a rural school. There was also another non-intervention school that they used to compare the results. The researcher noted that compared to the non-intervention school, the participants in the rural school did not indicate an improvement when compared to the non-intervention school, while the metropolitan students did. While the learning objective was to improve reading, writing, and oral language skills, the selected constructive apps may not have been the best tool for the learners in the rural areas because the researchers also noted that technology wasn't readily available in the classroom. It wasn't typically used. So if technology wasn't regularly integrated in the classroom, the constructive app, which doesn't provide a lot of support, really didn't benefit the goal of vocabulary acquisition. So instructive apps have more support. So students who need more support in their learning and understanding, instructive apps would probably work best. But constructive apps, there's the higher cognitive processing that needs to happen. Think Bloom's taxonomy at the very highest level, where you're talking about creation. Now let's talk about books. Just as the use of digital apps influence learning outcomes of students, the selection of digital stories and how they are used to support literacy objectives are an integral part in designing instruction. Researchers have noted the abundance of animated illustrations accompanied by text narration provides deeper information processing during the exposure when children are exposed to digital literacy books. Research has discovered that there are benefits of digital storybooks for the acquisition of lower socioeconomic students. And the results indicated that different multimedia features could impact the growth of vocabulary in different levels of learning. Similar to how those early childhood educators differentiate opportunities to support learners at their current levels, multimedia features can do the same thing to increase reading performance. While finding a significant increase in word meaning following the word-supported digital books in children with poorer skills, researchers actually discovered that there was no statistical difference in word gain scores among average and skilled readers. Similar to the findings that we found with the instructive apps, students with lower abilities need more explicit instruction than those with higher abilities to read. An educator has to have the ability to actually determine if the multimedia features are going to scaffold the students to meet a learning objective. Other studies have concluded that multimedia features can actually increase motivation for reading. Results indicated that motivation and sound effects, along with personalized learning engagement, support attention and enjoyment of early learning and reading. While these are entertaining features and definitely can sustain attention for our youngest learners, we need to make sure that the multimedia is actually being effective with the goals and the learning outcomes that we want to have happen. So how do we do this? Well, we assess. So early childhood educators have research-based developmentally appropriate practices that are used as a blueprint to implement strategies and learning opportunities. Early childhood educators engage in a reflective cycle to analyze curriculum, to first identify the students' needs and learning objectives, to then analyze curriculum and design it, and then to implement our instruction while scaffolding along the way, and then evaluating and determining the learning outcomes. So although research is discovering that these practices are consistently successful in the classroom, we also need to make sure that we are applying these same practices when we are using multimedia to ensure that learning outcomes are being met. So as research is telling us that it is important to choose the right multimedia app to support literacy development, researchers are also realizing that this is a difficult task to evaluate the effectiveness of digital apps. Researchers have actually discovered over 80,000 apps, 80,000 to be marketed to as educational for early learners. And more scary is that many of them are actually lacking a foundation based on the theories of early childhood development. This is a cause for great concern, and this kind of increases that negative perception of having multimedia be used in our early learning classrooms. So to counteract this, researchers developed and tested an evaluation tool for digital apps based on developmental research and the multimedia learning theory for early childhood professionals. This rubric here was designed to provide early childhood educators with support in identifying quality digital apps that can be utilized to support specific learning outcomes in the classroom. So this is a portion of the rubric that was created, and you can see that it focuses on the learning goals and the meaningful learning that needs to take place, and gives a very detailed description as to how we need to be looking at reviewing, what we need to be reviewing when we are looking at these apps before integrating them into the classroom. In addition to having a plethora of apps available for our early learners, we also have a ton of digital storybooks that are being created to transform the read aloud experience. So researchers again recognize the lack of reading developmental criteria for these digital book reviews that we may find. And it makes it difficult for us to analyze the effectiveness of these multimedia stories. So researchers combined an understanding of the effective instructional strategies to support reading in early learners and came up with an assessment criteria. They also use multimedia principles and different research-based multimedia aspects and digital features of books that are beneficial to actual attention instead of hindering attention. So this evaluation tool can support early childhood educators in choosing digital books that provide these specific multimedia features to enhance an understanding rather than take away from learning outcomes. So a portion of the rubric that was part of this study is here, and you can see that they categorize it as the digital format with digital features that assist with learning. And then specific criteria is again provided to the educator to then go ahead and rate the quality of the digital story. So as a child development expert, Fred Rogers saw the power of multimedia to build values in early education, but also recognized its limitations. He once said, "A computer can help you learn how to spell hug, H-U-G, but it can never know the risk or the actual joy of giving and receiving one." So the guidance of an early childhood educator remains a paramount consideration in the early learning classroom. It can seem overwhelming for an educator to decipher what is the best tool and what is the best way to integrate multimedia to help the early learner reach their potential. But based on the findings of these studies and the research of multimedia learning, we already know and use these skills by identifying student needs, choosing appropriate materials that are aligned with our learning objectives, and assessing the multimedia tool to meet those needs, a teacher can not only successfully build digital literacy in the classroom and in the students, but you now have an opportunity to support the other pillars of developmental needs. To return to Mr. Rogers' hug metaphor, it's not enough to recognize the existence of multimedia's role in early childhood education. We must experience the risk and the joy of actually embracing it. Thank you.